In this lesson, we will have a first look at the passive in English, what it is, how to form it, and when not to use it. The passive is what grammarians call a voice. English has two voices. The other voice is the active. Grammatical voice has nothing to do with speaking. Instead, it refers to the relationship between the subject of a sentence and its verb. The best way to understand the term is to see an example of each voice. In the active voice, we can say that the subject of the sentence is the doer of the verb. So, for example, in the baby, subject, broke the toy, the baby is the doer of the breaking. In the passive voice, the toy was broken by the baby, the grammatical subject, toy, is not the doer, but the done to. Here are three more examples of the passive. In each case, the grammatical subject, i.e. the red words, is not the doer of the action, but the done to. The correct grammatical term for done to is patient, and the doer is the agent. Okay, now that you know what the passive is, let's look at how to form the passive. To start with, it is important that you know how to conjugate verbs as shown here. Do, did, done, cut, 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 cook, cooked, cooked, and write, wrote, written. The first key element of the passive is the past participle, the third verb form here. All passive constructions use the past participle. If you see a sentence without a past participle, then you're not seeing the passive. So, to create the passive, you need the past participle of the action verb, but you also need the auxiliary verb to be in one of its forms. In the sentence, the toy was broken by the baby, broken is the past participle, and was is the auxiliary verb to be in the past tense. This slide shows versions of the same event in various common and less common verb constructions, or tenses as traditional grammarians call them. Note that only the auxiliary verb in red changes. The past participle stays the same. Quiz page. Pause the video if you want to review the questions and answers before continuing. It is relatively easy to understand what the passive is and how to form it, but now let's discuss the more difficult question of when to use it. If you have used a grammar checking tool such as Microsoft Word or Grammarly, you will no doubt have seen a suggestion like this. The message alerts you that you are using the passive and implies that there is a potential problem in doing so. After all, it never alerts you to your use of the active. This message unsettles writers who don't have enough grammatical knowledge to know when to ignore it. Now, in the case of the sentence, the cake was eaten by me, the use of the passive certainly seems weaker than the active, I ate the cake. But there are several contexts in which a passive construction may be the better choice. One reason to use the passive is when the agent is unknown. For example, the school gate was damaged last night. We don't know if it was damaged by a car, a person, or a storm. And in any case, it is not the agent that is important. What is important is what happened, not who or what did it. Another reason to use the passive is when it's obvious who the agent is. For example, a student was arrested for damaging the school gate. It is only the police who can legally arrest someone, so it's not necessary in this case to name the agent. This is also the reason why we use the passive in I was born in 1997 and not the active my mother bore me in 1997. This is why the highlighted suggestion here from Microsoft is not necessarily a good one. You may wish to focus on Eric and the fact he was given more work, without needing to state that it was his boss who gave it to him, which in any case is probably fairly obvious in the context. A further reason to use the passive is in order to intentionally obscure the agent. A famous example of this is "mistakes were made." The speaker used the passive to avoid needing to say who made the mistakes, whether he did or somebody else. This agentless passive is a useful ploy for politicians. But the desire to avoid stating the agent may be more justifiable in certain contexts. Let's look again at Microsoft's suggestions here. In using the passive, the speaker is avoiding saying directly who should take the garbage out. This can be viewed as a sensible, non-confrontational approach in personal relationships. Finally, we can generalize that the passive is the more formal of the two voices and is therefore more appropriate in academic writing. For example, it is the convention to use the passive in scientific writing to shift the focus away from the researcher to the research itself. So, we have considered several contexts in which the passive is the better choice. Now let's take a look at when not to use the passive. The basic advice is use the active unless you have a good reason to use the passive. There are 3 grounds for this recommendation. Firstly, the active voice, in which the agent is the subject of the sentence and the verb tells what he, she or it does, is the default. Flouting the default produces odd sentences such as "the last cookie has just been eaten by John," instead of the much more natural "John has just eaten the last cookie." Secondly, the passive can come across as overly formal or even pompous or ridiculous. Consider the sentence I said a minute ago in its passive form. Now let a look be taken by us at when the passive is not to be used. Nobody wants to hear or read such convoluted text. Furthermore, in informal language, the passive is often avoided even when the agent is not known or not important. This is done by using the pronouns someone or they to create active constructions, such as "someone has broken the window," or "they're digging up the road outside the house," where the agent is the subject of the sentence. Microsoft's reason for recommending the active is that it results in livelier and more persuasive sentences. This is true in many contexts, and it is certainly the case that active sentences are shorter than passive sentences that name the agent with a bi-prepositional phrase. For this reason, they may be more easily understood by non-native speakers of English. Quiz page. Pause the video if you want to review the questions and answers before continuing. Here is a summary of this introduction to the passive, what it is, how to form it, and when to or not to use it. In the second lesson, we will look at more advanced aspects of this important grammar topic, including 2 further reasons why the passive is often the better choice than the active. In the description below this video, you will find a link to the lesson index page shown on the left. As you can see, there are 4 ways to access the content, as well as a glossary and links to quizzes and more information on the topic.